Golden Kamuy, one of my favorite manga of all time, depicts an Ainu girl, Ashilipa, and a veteran from the Russo-Japanese War, Saichi Sugimoto, who is immortal, set on a quest looking for the lost gold of the Ainu people. The manga have sold millions of copies worldwide, winning countless awards both for the manga and the animation. In the manga, we see our characters roam around the beautiful snowy land of Hokkaido, engage in wildlife hunting, eating Ainu cuisine, and many other things. But most importantly, their final goal is to use this pot of gold to buy a land to set up an Ainu autonomous zone. Now imagine, instead of the borderless snow peaks and the never-ceasing flowing river, we see this, the Nibutani Dam. First started building in 1990 and is finished in 1997. It reminded me of the first time I visited Inner Mongolia. I was expecting the prairies, horse-riding Mongolians, the traditional tents where they serve you roasted whole lamb. But what I saw was wind turbines, hundreds of them, turning the prairie into a wind turbine forest. It was at this moment when I thought to myself, why? Where is the last holy land of nature? And why would the prairie people allow such things to be built? Well, in this video, I want to talk about this complex relationship between government-led development and indigenous right through the case of the Nibutani Dam. The Nibutani Dam case introduced a multifaceted concept surrounding the Ainu identity, an identity that has been suppressed since the foundation of the modern Japanese state. First of all, it is important to note that Ainu people, as identified by the court, are minorities. The court views the indigenous people as a social group who live and have lived in a region which historically existed outside of a state's rule and was brought within the state as a minority. Most importantly, the indigenous group possesses a culture and identity that is different. Well, what is Ainu culture and what is different about it? The fundamental Ainu culture focuses on hunting, gathering, and fishing, where they spend their life together with nature, bound by their gods. For example, famine is seen as a human failure because it is a result of lack of respect to the prey. It reminded me of John Locke and other early liberalists that emphasize temperance, and the core message being only take what you need. Here, I want to focus on two major aspects of what constitutes Ainu identity with nature: sea-coordinate and salmon fishing. Sea-coordinate in Ainu's language means our river. It was the name of an activist group in 1995 as part of an initiative to revitalize Ainu culture by opposing the Nibutani Dam construction and conserving the forest. One of the major objectives for the group is to plant elm trees, the material to make traditional Ainu clothing. Planting trees is not a simple process of just following a manual. It is a verbal history that has been passed down for generations. For example, on what plants have to live at one spot, which plant is poisonous, their Ainu names with meanings and stories. Salmon, on the other hand, is also an important component of the Ainu story. 2 out of 13 Ainu gods' tales are about salmon. One of the stories talks about a vicious man who turned the stream into poisonous water by setting up tree trunks in the river. Because the river is blocked, the salmon cannot go back to their original breeding ground. Eventually, it was a son of Okikurumuri, a personal god of the Ainu, who was able to fight over the vicious man and recover the clean river and the salmon. Sounds familiar? It sounds familiar because the Nibutani Dam is just like the vicious man that's blocking the river. At the same time, the 20th century Japanese government had banned the hunting of salmon for the Ainu people. The government expects artificial breeding to bring economic benefit. When you take total gains and losses into account, the damage to the minority can be ignored. They may be driven to be farmers. The banning of salmon fishing is only part of the assimilationist politics. From the latter half of the 18th century to the middle of the 19th century, the Edo shogunate feared the advance of the Russian hegemony into the land of Hokkaido. The Ainu people were made to use Japanese language to eat rice and the like. In the end, these policies failed owing to strong resistance by the Ainu people. These policies at the time symbolizes a violation and annexation of land from the Ainu Mosir. In the Ainu Memoir, Our Land Was a Forest, Shigeru Kayano argues the Shamon law, which is a law that banned salmon fishing, was as good as telling the Ainu, who had always lived on salmon, to die. It is interesting to note that Shigeru Kayano and Koichi Kaizawa being the elm tree planter, are the two farmers who filed a lawsuit against the dam project. So what have the court achieved? The most important decision of the court is to abrogate the Ancient Protection Act of 1899 that identifies the Ainu as Kyodojin and forced them to integrate into the mainstream Japanese society, and now refers to Ainu as a people. The court emphasized that the people shall be respected as individuals. Their right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness should be the supreme consideration in legislation and in other government affairs. The claim manifests individualism and democracy in the case of the Ainu people. What a glorious decision. It is what the Ainu people have been asking for, right? Kaizawa was a strong advocate for self-governance based on the post-colonial reality. He said that, I hope for the establishment of Ainu self-government in an area where our Ainu culture, right, is fully recognized and can be enjoyed by all. If this can be realized, our culture and language will survive, even if our territory exists inside Japanese territory. It shouldn't be a surprise that the court ruling fell short at carrying real change. The immediate signal of failure of the court decision is the fact that the dam is still standing today. It is because the consideration of public interest as a balancing factor. The court is aware of the value that are being compromised for the public interest, and the severe consequence of the dam that would make it more difficult for the future generation of the Ainu people, the people that are closely associated with the area, with a spiritual culture founded upon togetherness with nature. Court argued that in the case where such great concessions are made, there must also be the greatest degree of consideration that includes a sense of remorse concerning matters such as that described above of the historical background, of the coerced deterioration of the Ainu people's unique ethnic culture caused by assimilationist policies. However, as good as this might sound, the court sort of shrugged its shoulder and said that because the dam is already filled, there is also extraordinary harm to the public interest that would arise from removing the dam. So the dam have to stay. From a long-term perspective, instead of creating recognition and protection of indigenous rights, the court based its decision on the lack of promotion and teaching of Ainu culture. The court decided that it is the lack of indigenous participation in the development process of the dam that illegitimate their construction. The court criticized the government for failing to assess the situation fairly because it is clear that from the very beginning there was a meager understanding of the Ainu people as a minority. The solution would be simple. We should involve the Ainu people into the decision-making of these national projects. This is exactly what it did for the Biratori Dam, the next construction in the Ainu region on the Sairu River. The local government organizes the committee for the investigation of Ainu culture and the environment protection, and they identify sites that are sacred to the Ainu people, which are going to be submerged if the dam is built. These sites are emotionally important to the Ainu people, an inseparable part of their daily life. However, the problem with the sites is that the alternatives proposed by the committee are either too far away or simply don't qualify as a substitute for the sacred site. It sure seems like the dam would be a harmful addition to the indigenous people, but the construction started regardless. This is mostly because the purpose of the projects was only to predict the impact of the construction, which means that it is not against the construction of the dam. The final report is only a reference for the final decision. Thus, the problem is the indigenous people still have no power over final decision-making. The current assessment process only recognizes indigenous participation as a due process, rather than an active posture to listen to their requests. Furthermore, these assessments have an unequal preference to a professional technological consultants where indigenous people lack particular knowledge of. The Briatore Dam is not unique, as in the US, the construction of the Hoover Dam totally disregard the indigenous impact assessment. The indigenous people have no power over the final decision because the developers are reluctant to include a non-scientific assessment. While the UN has been promoting indigenous rights to protect their culture and practices, the government failed to acknowledge these rights, resulting in human rights abuses. Heritage by itself is usually a tangible term, such as a heritage site set up by UNESCO. But it is inherently wrong to overemphasize the tangible over intangible expression in the narrative of a heritage. Heritage can be defined as the objects, places, knowledge, custom, practices, relationships with other species, stories, songs, and designs passed between generations that define or contribute to a person or group's identity, history, worldview, and well-being. To respect an indigenous cultural heritage is more than an academic interest. It is obviously related to consent, sovereignty, and jurisdictions as reflected in the Niputani Dam cases. To destroy a heritage is an act of violence because to the Ainu people, the landscape is alive with history. Their connection to the land is living and real. To emphasize economy over heritage value cut off their relationship to the land, killing the ties between the people and nature. So the question now is, what can we do as everyday people? I want to first say that it is also dangerous to imagine a heritage as a stagnant concept because it represents a certain prejudice of people viewing from the outside and map their romanticized indigenous culture onto the indigenous people. I think the most important thing is to respect their choices because who are we to decide what is good for them? Recognize them as equal and sovereign just like us. It is another form of white man's burden when we think we are going in with good intentions, but instead we're reinforcing the stereotype without their consent. On the other hand, why are we making it seem like only the indigenous people are considering nature as part of their life? I think the problem is, as everyday people, we lack the appreciation of nature. We're embedded in the concept of technology that we lost the connection to what is the most important. Maybe when we are fascinated about indigenous culture, we are seeing ourselves in an unachievable future.